All right, everybody, welcome to Lecture 7. We're going to go over aerobic training methods here. I'm going to start off by saying that these methods on here are mostly targeted towards training for actual aerobic events. You're not going to really use most of these with your Gen Pop or rehab or PT populations. There's one that you will use, that's the long slow distance. We'll get into that. But you as a potential strength and conditioning coach, and even if you're working with someone who's relatively fit or trained enough, that's in Gen Pop. You could even use some of this stuff with, but these are more tools in your toolbox, right? And we want to have as much of an arsenal as possible when it comes to options for helping out our clients or athletes or whoever. So we got to have an understanding of all this stuff to make sure that we are in the best shape possible for helping people when they need it. Because again, we are looking for specific stressors to drive specific adaptations to reach specific goals, right? So if somebody's looking to increase their cardiovascular ability, you might be able to pull some of these out of your back pocket, right? We know our fitness guidelines that we went over in lecture 2, but how do we apply that, right? Like what things are we actually doing when we're talking about that? Now, these methods are things that you can use to help somebody train at specific spots in their aerobic capabilities, right? So a very easy way to compare it, when you look at strength, you have your really, really heavy ability, your really, really strong weight, right? So you have a certain way you train when you're working with really, really heavy weights, and that drives a really specific adaptation, right, to get really strong. Then you have this other thing where you don't train as heavy, but you do a lot of reps, right? And a lot of reps gives you a little bit more size and more hypertrophy. So even though they're both strength training, they drive really different adaptations, right? So when you look at aerobic, you can look at it the same way, where these different things, even though they're all aerobic and cardiovascular, we're looking for and attacking different aspects, specific aspects that somebody might need. How you apply each one, when you apply each one, to what person, to who they are, totally different conversation. So that's something that you'll go over in strength and conditioning theory, where you're going to really have to dive into your needs analysis and understand, okay, I have X athlete who has these capabilities and is missing these. What are the things we're missing? How do we actually get those adaptations to improve? When you get to that point, you can look back to this and say, oh, well, we have all these options on here. What are we trying to accomplish for each one? What is each one of these trying to accomplish, and how can we implement that with that person to make that happen? Okay? So that's really where we're going to target this lecture for you guys, is just getting your foot in the door, adding more to your arsenal of knowledge as far as what things you can do. Okay? So the first thing I want to do is I want you to go down and look at on lecture 7, is look at how to measure aerobic fitness. Okay? There's 4 things there, right? And you have to have an understanding of what these things are and which ones you should or shouldn't use in X situation. So if you look, we got VO2, heart rate, RPE, and distance. Real quick, VO2 is your gold standard of aerobic measurement, right? So when you are thinking of somebody, for example, how do I know how strong somebody is, right? We test X movement, right? Most likely you can test like a back squat, right? If the person can do it. But you test like a back squat and you see what their force output is. And that's like the big gold standard number. We can say, okay, you're pretty strong, not pretty strong. VO2 is that alike for aerobic fitness, where this is our like gold standard, where you could look at the classifications for VO2, which you'll get into in XPhys and XPhys2, and you'll say, hey, okay, you are at a 40 VO2, which is pretty average, right? Okay, this person's at a 65 VO2. You are unreal when it comes to cardiovascular ability. It's almost insane how good you are. So you can have this VO2 measurement and classification to let you know where somebody's at, but also you use VO2 as a measure to see if somebody's improving or not. How do you measure VO2? You'll get into that with XFIS, okay? So what we need to understand right now is that your VO2 is really just the volume of oxygen that you can consume during exercise, whether usually it's tested maximally, and that's how you get that number. So just for now, you need to know that VO2 is your standard of measurement, right? So just like when we were looking at heart rate reserve and with the fitness guidelines, it said, hey, like, for high intensity, we need to be 60% plus, or we need to be 60 to 80% of our heart rate reserve, right? That is the same thing, but for VO2. VO2 is our gold standard of aerobic capability. So usually when you're looking at situations with athletes, like endurance athletes, you're going to have some sort of measurement with VO2, okay? Heart rate. You know heart rate is strongly correlated with VO2. So usually if your VO2 is going up, so is your heart rate. So in a situation where you don't have the capability to measure somebody's VO2, which for most of us is pretty likely, you can be sound in tracking their heart rate and using heart rate zones like heart rate reserve or just max heart rate to say and judge where somebody's at, right? And that's really easy to measure somebody's heart rate nowadays. Like, you can have a Fitbit. Everybody can have a Fitbit. I mean, anybody here who has an Apple Watch, boom, you got your heart rate. Is it very accurate? Maybe not, but it's still a measurement that you can use. Other two things. Now, these are not ones that you should probably hold your hat or hang your hat on. They're just there as secondary and additional things that you can maybe use to justify what you're doing. And that's RP and that's distance. So RP, rating of perceived exertion. There's two ways that you can use RPE. The first one is a 1 to 10 scale, right? Everybody knows the 1 to 10 scale. Hey, 1 feeling the best you've ever felt or 10 feeling the worst you've ever felt, right? Whatever it is, how intense is it? Usually with these scales, low intensity is the lower numbers, high intensity is the higher numbers, right? So like the way I would explain is how I just did. I would ask somebody, and I did the other day, said, hey, 1 being the best you've ever felt in your life, 10 this being the worst workout you've ever done in your life, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling like a 6.5, 7. Okay, now I have a gauge of where you're at, right? So that's something that I can use, you can use in a session, before a session, to kind of get an idea subjectively how somebody's feeling. But you can never trust subjectively fully because some people don't have an understanding of really what a 10 is, right? They don't know what the worst workout they've ever felt is, or etc., right? The other scale is a 7 to 20 scale. That's Borg's RPE scale. The reason it's 7 to 20 is because that one is supposed to match your heart rate. So any number on the 7 to 20 scale, like multiply it by 10. And that's like supposed to match the heart rate you're at. So if I'm doing something and someone goes, hey, what RP are you at? And usually they have a sign up and they'll point. Someone might point to 14, right? And I'd be like, ooh, that's where I'm at. So if you measured my heart rate at the same time, it could say or should be around 140 beats per minute. So you have two options as far as the different ways you could use RP, but they're both there, okay? And then lastly is distance. Very simple. It's, okay, like, you ran 1.3 miles the first time, and then 8 weeks later you ran 5. So we have distance to even show, hey, you're getting better at this. You could also, look at the amount of distance you run in a certain amount of time. Okay, you have 15 minutes to run. Let's see how far you get. And week 1, you get half a mile, and then week 8, you get 2.5, right? Like you can use that too as just a measure, but again, it's not very representative of the aerobic, like physiological aerobic capability. It's just not something to hang your hat on, right? So VO2 and heart rate, those ones are gold standard. Those are the ones you want to use if you can. If you can't, then you work your way heart rate, RPE, distance, okay? So that's how you measure the fitness of somebody, which is important to know because showing someone measurements is one of the best ways you can get them to get buy-in. So if you are working with somebody and you don't ever show them that they are improving, it's going to be a tough sell to get that person to keep coming back, right? So one of the reasons personally for me that I time people's sprints all the time is I always have a measure to say, hey, look at what you're doing. You are getting better. And then you go, wow, I am improving. Man, I want to keep doing this. that's a very, very unique, or not unique, it's just a very simple strategy to get people to want to continue training. Because, like I've said, like getting somebody to do any of this stuff once, twice, 3 times, 1 month, 3 months, that's great, but that's not going to make change. Change happens over a long, consistent period of time. So the more ways you can find to get somebody to buy in and continue to train, the better off you are. And having objective data is a two bird, one stone, right? Not only is it good for that reason where the person sees they're improving, but it's good for you to track this to show proof that what you're doing is working, or this type of program yields this type of adaptation for this person, okay? So you have that now as far as how to measure it. You'll go very in depth in XFIS 1, XFIS 2 with how to actually measure those things. That's not in the scope of this class. It's just you need to know that you can do that, okay? We're going to get into these 4 methods here, okay? So there's 4 aerobic training methods we're going to go over, and I'm going to give the little bullet points about what each one kind of does for you, and we'll talk a little bit about, maybe where to apply it, but that's more in the scope of a programming class. So if you are an endurance athlete and you have questions about this, please reach out and we can try to have a conversation about it. Okay. Again, my scope is really with, power and high CNS, like, the anaerobic type training. That's really where a lot of my knowledge is. I do have an understanding of this, but I don't work with a lot of endurance athletes. I have before, and I can tell you what I've done with them. But that I just need you to know that going into this, that I'm not your go-to source on that. Okay. I do have enough knowledge to talk about it and let you know what it is, and I have used some of this stuff. But if there's someone here who's really, really interested in this, I would say Dr. Sowers is probably the person you want to go talk to, at least as a starting spot. And even Dr. Davis. I mean, Dr. Davis, was a marathon runner. She is an endurance athlete. I mean, look at her and look at me, right? That's somebody that you can go and talk to try to figure out more about this if you're really interested in that. Okay, anyways. So we have 4 methods. I'm going to go over them, and we're going to learn about what they are. So the first one, long, slow distance. So if you, in your head, if I said cardio and you're like, hey, we're going to go do some cardio, this is probably what most people think of. It's your low intensity, conversational training that takes a really long time and is a longer distance. So the point is, if we're looking at an athlete who runs the 800, okay, we need to be having them work at 70% of their VO2 max, which if you've measured it, great. If you haven't, then you can go about 80% of the max heart rate, okay? So aerobically, it's still a little challenging, but it's not damaging, okay? The training distance has to be longer than what your actual event is, okay? And this is going to last 30 minutes to 2 hours. Your intensity, as I said, should be conversational. So you should literally be able to have a conversation with somebody while you're doing this. If you can't, then the intensity is too high and it's defeating the purpose. What this training's trying to do, it's obviously going to enhance the overall cardiovascular function, but you're really trying to increase the utilization of fat as a fuel. So there's this other thing that you're going to do when you get into XFIS and X2 is you're going to basically learn and do a lab where you can watch real time live and figure out what type of fuel somebody is utilizing while they're training based upon how much carbon dioxide they are expirating while they're training. So there's a way that you can figure out, and again, not my scope, this is something that you need to go to another professor about, but there's a way that you can tell, and there's a ratio that will literally tell you whether you are more on the fat utilization or carb utilization, right? Carbs a little bit more fast acting, that's where you get the glycolysis involved, but fat as a fuel is where you're really looking at the more of a true aerobic side of things. And the benefit of that is that you have a lot of extra fat stores in your body that are going to allow you to keep pulling from that continuously over time, which will keep providing you energy. So for someone who has really long distances to run, then aerobically they're going to be able to continue to do that at a very, very low intensity. So the faster that you can for running example, the faster you can run while still utilizing fat as a fuel only pushes your back end further of what you're going to be able to do as far as distance and time in a meet. So that's why LSD is really important. It's also really important because it's honestly a helpful recovery tool. So that's another one why you would use that, okay? Frequency, 1 to 2 days a week, depending on the person. That's where we're going to leave it. We're not going to go too much into that after that. Okay, so that's your long, slow distance. Interval. So interval training, this exercise is close to your VO2 max. So what you're trying to do, depending on how intense it is you're trying to get somebody to work towards maximal VO2. But we want to spend more time at maximal VO2 than normal. So if you just had somebody say, hey, we're going to put you at 95% of your VO2 and you're going to go as long as you can. You might get 4 or 5 minutes out of that total. The interval is good because what you do is you have a work interval where you go 3 to 5 minutes, and it can be even less, like 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, at that really high intensity, and then you back it off with work or with rest intervals, okay? And those rest intervals are going to drop the intensity down to what would be similar to like an LSD, right? So you go back and forth between, but what happens is, like, let's say we do 2-minute intervals, right? And remember the first example, we only got 5 minutes at max VO2. If we do interval and we do 2 minutes and we're able to get even 3 intervals, we're already at 6 minutes total time spent towards max VO2. So that's why it's beneficial, because you get more time at that high intensity. So you get to push that high intensity, that max. You essentially are trying to push your max VO2 ceiling up. If your max VO2 ceiling continues to go up, everything else also gets better. So your lactate threshold goes farther away from where it was, which means you can spend more time utilizing fat as a fuel when you do your LSD. You get more efficient while you're running. That's why this is really important. The big thing here, and this is why it's bold, do not perform interval training until a firm base of aerobic endurance of training is established, aka this person should be an athlete. Like, they should already have a good training base. And even if they are an athlete, throughout the training year, you need to already have a good base for somebody, because if this is really, really intense, and it's going to be very, very tough to recover from if you don't give a person enough time. Okay? So that's interval training. So you got your LSD, which is really down here. You got your interval, which is really up here in intensity, and that's why you want to have that in there. Okay? Another one. Tempo training, okay? So the intensity is slightly higher than race pace, okay? So you got to think, interval, we're working on max VO2. You're trying to push your VO2 ceiling, right? Tempo training, we're trying to work like around a little bit above what your race pace is, right? So for example, if someone runs an 800, a 3200, right? They have a certain pace that they're trying to hit to continuously keep that so they hit a certain time. So when we're doing the tempos, we want to work a little bit above that. So we're working a little bit faster. You have 2 types. We got steady pace tempo training. So that one, continuous training conducted at an intensity equal to lactate threshold for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Okay. I'm not going to get into exactly what the lactate threshold is, right? But essentially, that's when you stop really using fat as a fuel and it switches more to carbs turning into a fuel, right? You switch more to a glycolytic state and an anaerobic state once that happens, because you started to produce too much lactate. That's an ex-phys thing, okay? So in ex-phys, you're going to get all that information, okay? But we want to work somebody like right at that, and the purpose is so that we can try to improve our aerobic and anaerobic contribution of energy to those systems while we're right there. So pushing somebody right at the lactate threshold gets them comfortable right there. And hopefully it gets them more efficient and keeps pushing the lactate threshold further away. So you have more intensity that you can train without it. Okay? The other one you could do, intermittent pace tempo training. So intensity is the same as for a steady threshold workout, but the training session consists of a series of shorter intervals with brief recovery periods. This sounds like interval training, but it's not, and that's just because of the intensity. It's the same kind of purpose where we're pushing a little bit over race pace, and then we work back down. A little bit over race pace, a little bit back down. And This one is because is more helpful for improving running economy, but it also gets the body adjusted to what pace we're trying to run at. Okay, and the key there is keep the intensity around race pace. When you're doing these kind of tempo training, you don't want to push the intensity, right? If anything, you try to push the distance that you run, the total distance that you're getting at a certain pace. Interval training is where you push your ceiling, right? So the big difference between interval and tempos and the different tempos is the intensity level, okay? And then lastly, we have fartlek training. So that one is a combination of the two previous. So this is where you have some easy running that's at 70% of VO2 max, and then it's combined with really fast bursts of 85 to 90% of VO2 max, okay? The difference between fartlek and interval is the amount of time that you're spending. So this one is very quick hits, very small time periods for the high intensity, and then it's very long. It's longer periods for the 70%. So a really good example of this one. I'm sure some people have done something like this before. Imagine you're on like a football field or a soccer field even or a lacrosse field, and you have the long sides of the field here, and then you have crossing here. So a fartlek example would be, okay, you jog the sideline, sprint across the goal line, jog the sideline, sprint across the goal line, jog, sprint. So you're going back and forth between a really quick burst of something that's really high intensity paired with a really low intensity thing. Okay, the difference between fartlek and the difference between interval is just the time. It's the amount of time you're spending. So the work intervals should be between 3 to 5 minutes here for the interval, but down here we're going even quicker, and that's really probably 30 seconds or less. So that's where you can see the difference. I know they all seem a little similar, but there is a difference between them. Okay, so that is your aerobic training methods. Like I said, lactate threshold is something you will get totally caught up on when it comes to XPhys 1 and XPhys 2 if you haven't already had it. And then 2, the programming as far as when and how much to do each of these things, that's something that you're going to learn when you get into strength and conditioning theory. Okay? So that was the first part of these lectures. There's another part after this that I want you to check out. Okay? Have a good one.